Dawn broke over the northern wilderness with a stillness that only comes in early autumn. Thin ribbons of mist hovered above the forest floor, weaving between ancient pines that stood like sentinels over the landscape. The air carried the first hint of the coming cold, a crispness that stung the lungs and left a ghost of breath hanging in the morning light. The ranger had been awake for hours. 23 years in the service had trained his body to rise before the sun, a habit that persisted through weekends and holidays alike. He stood on the porch of the modest station outpost, a steaming mug of coffee warming his weathered hands. At 48, his body bore the marks of a life spent in the elements. Sun-creased skin around piercing blue eyes, a sturdy frame hardened by countless miles of wilderness trails, and shoulders that carried the invisible weight of responsibility for the 30,000 acres under his protection. This particular morning, he savored the solitude. The visitor season was winding down, the families and weekend hikers gradually disappearing as temperatures dropped and days shortened. Soon, the park would belong almost exclusively to the wildlife and the handful of rangers who remained through the winter months. He preferred it this way, had always preferred it this way. The human silence allowed the true voice of the forest to emerge. His radio crackled softly on his hip, the morning check-in from headquarters. He responded with the practiced brevity of a man who valued words as finite resources, to be spent judiciously. After 23 years, the routine communications had become as natural as breathing. Sector 4, all clear. Starting East Trail inspection, out. The ranger drained the last of his coffee, the bitter grounds collecting at the bottom of the mug like sediment. Inside the station, he rinsed it in the small sink, movements economical and precise. The small building had been his second home for over 2 decades, its Spartan furnishings reflecting his own pragmatic nature. A desk piled with weather reports and wildlife surveys, a narrow cot for overnight shifts, a wall of topographical maps, their surface marked with annotations in his neat, compact handwriting. The morning light strengthened as he gathered his gear, a pack containing water, emergency supplies, a first aid kit, his tablet for documenting observations, and the lunch his wife had packed the night before. 17 years of marriage, and still she insisted on preparing his meals. "Someone's got to make sure you eat something besides beef jerky," she'd say, and he'd pretend to be annoyed by the fussing. The truth was, he cherished the ritual, this thread of domesticity that connected his wilderness world to the home they'd built together. A framed photograph on his desk caught the light as he turned to leave, his wife and teenage son standing beside a mountain lake, their faces alight with laughter. The boy had his mother's smile, thank God, and not his father's stoicism. The ranger allowed himself a moment with the image before sliding on his official jacket, the uniform transforming him from husband and father into guardian of the wilderness. Outside, he performed his usual inspection of the service vehicle, a ritual born of both training and experience. The forest might be growing quiet with the approach of winter, but it never became truly safe. He'd learned that lesson 15 years ago, when a sudden storm had stranded him 10 miles from shelter with a failing radio. 3 days it had taken him to make it back to base, his survival dependent on the emergency supplies he now insisted all rangers carry. The incident had taught him to respect the wilderness in a way no training manual could convey. As he drove along the service road, the ranger noted the changing colors in the canopy above, the first gold and crimson leaves beginning to appear among the deep greens. The transition always triggered a contradictory response in him, appreciation for the beauty and melancholy for the approaching harshness of winter. He'd spent enough seasons here to anticipate the rhythm of change, to feel it in his bones like an old injury that ached before rain. The East Trail needed inspection after the heavy rainfall 3 days prior. Water damage could compromise paths, create hazardous conditions for any remaining hikers, and potentially impact wildlife movement patterns. It was routine work, but essential. The ranger had long ago learned that in wilderness management, prevention through vigilance was far more effective than reaction to crisis. Something felt off this morning, though. He couldn't name it, just a subtle wrongness that prickled at the back of his neck. 23 years had honed his instincts to the point where he trusted them implicitly. The forest was too quiet, the usual morning chorus of birds conspicuously absent. Even the squirrels and chipmunks, typically abundant in this section, were nowhere to be seen. The ranger slowed the vehicle, rolling down the window to better sense the environment. The air carried the expected sense of pine and damp earth, but underneath lurked something else, something he couldn't immediately identify. He frowned, making a mental note to check the recent wildlife reports for unusual activity. He parked at the trailhead and continued on foot, eyes constantly scanning the surroundings with practiced efficiency. The path showed signs of the recent rainfall, small washouts in places, debris scattered across the trail, but nothing requiring major repair. Still, the unusual silence persisted, broken only by the soft crunch of his boots on the gravel path and the occasional rustle of wind through the canopy above. 3 miles in, he paused at an overlook that provided a panoramic view of the valley below. In the distance, mist still clung to the surface of the lake, but it would burn off by midday. The vista never failed to stir something profound in him, a reminder of why he'd chosen this life. His colleagues who'd moved on to administrative positions often asked if he ever grew tired of the isolation. The question always struck him as nonsensical. How could one tire of this? The seasonal visitors, with their smartphones and Bluetooth speakers, their complaints about cellular reception. They were the ones missing the point entirely. The ranger checked his watch. Still early. He'd make it to the river crossing before noon, document the condition of the bridge that had been repaired last spring, then circle back through the North Loop. A full day's work, but manageable. As he continued along the trail, the feeling of wrongness intensified. Halfway to the river, he encountered the first tangible sign that his instincts weren't misleading him. Fresh tracks crossed the path. A large black bear, moving at speed, heading away from the river rather than toward it. Unusual behavior this time of year, when bears typically remained near water sources as they prepared for winter. The ranger crouched, examining the impressions in the soft earth. Something had spooked the animal, driving it to abandon prime foraging territory. His hand moved instinctively to the bear spray on his belt, a precautionary gesture born of experience rather than fear. In nearly a quarter-century of service, he'd only had to use it twice. Both times the bears had been acting erratically, once due to injury, once protecting cubs. This track showed no sign of injury, the weight distribution even, the stride consistent with healthy movement. The ranger rose, eyes scanning the surrounding forest with renewed vigilance. The silence felt oppressive now, a vacuum where there should be life. He considered radioing in, but hesitated. What would he report? A feeling? Unusual bear movement? Neither constituted an emergency, and he'd face good-natured ribbing from the other rangers for being jumpy. Instead, he continued forward with heightened awareness, senses attuned to the environment in a way that transcended conscious thought. The trail began to descend toward the river, the vegetation growing denser as the path followed the natural contours of the land. Here, the silence gave way to the distant sound of running water, a welcome intrusion in the unnatural quiet. The bridge came into view, the newly installed support beams still bright against the weathered planking. The ranger paused, extracting his tablet to document the structure's condition, when movement at the periphery of his vision caused him to freeze mid-motion. 50 yards upstream, partially concealed by a stand of young aspens, was a tent. The ranger lowered the tablet slowly, eyes fixed on the unexpected intrusion in the landscape. Camping was strictly prohibited in this section of the park. All overnight visitors were required to use designated campsites 5 miles west. The area was clearly marked with day-use-only signs at every access point. He approached cautiously, professionalism overriding curiosity. Unauthorized camping wasn't uncommon, particularly during peak season when official sites filled quickly. Usually it involved inexperienced hikers unaware of regulations or individuals deliberately seeking isolation. Either way, standard procedure was to document the violation, educate the campers on proper protocol, and escort them to authorized areas if necessary. But as he drew closer, several details registered as inconsistent with typical unauthorized camping. First, the tent's positioning, set back from both the trail and the water, partially concealed by vegetation, as if deliberately hidden from casual observation. Second, the complete absence of typical campsite sounds. No voices, no movement, not even the rustling of someone inside the tent. And third, most troublingly, the condition of the site itself. There was no orderly arrangement of gear that would indicate current occupation. No camp stove, no chairs, no hanging bear bag. Instead, various items were scattered haphazardly around the clearing, a single boot lying on its side, clothing partially spilling from a backpack, cooking utensils strewn across the ground rather than neatly stowed. "Hello? Park Service," the ranger called out, maintaining a professional tone while his right hand moved instinctively to rest near his bear spray. Protocol for approaching unknown situations. Announce presence, identify authority, assess response. No response came. The tent remained motionless, its faded blue fabric billowing slightly in the gentle breeze. The ranger called out again, louder this time. "Is anyone here? This is a restricted camping area." Still nothing. His heartbeat accelerated slightly as he crossed the invisible boundary into the campsite, eyes continuously scanning for movement, ears straining for any sound beyond the persistent gurgle of the nearby river. 23 years of wilderness experience had taught him to recognize the signs of abandoned camps, usually the result of sudden weather changes, injuries requiring evacuation, or occasionally, hikers simply leaving equipment behind rather than carrying it out. But this was different. The chaos spoke of hasty departure, not gradual abandonment. The ranger knelt beside the scattered gear, examining it with a professional eye. High-quality equipment, well-maintained but showing signs of extended use. Experienced hikers then, not novices who might panic at the first sign of difficulty. His gaze settled on a detail that sent a chill up his spine despite the warming day. Drag marks in the soft earth, leading from the tent entrance toward the river. Not the clean, narrow impressions of someone dragging a heavy pack, but wider, irregular disturbances in the soil, interspersed with what appeared to be handprints pressed deep into the mud. The ranger's breathing became measured, deliberate, as his training asserted itself over the primitive whisper of alarm. He documented the scene with his tablet, capturing images of the scattered equipment, the drag marks, the tent's position relative to the trail. Only then, with objective evidence secured, did he approach the tent itself. "Final notice before I open this tent," he announced, though he now expected no response. "Park Service conducting a wellness check." The tent flap was partially unzipped, another sign of hasty departure. The ranger pulled it fully open, crouching to peer inside. The beam of his flashlight swept across the interior, revealing a scene of disarray that mirrored the campsite outside. Sleeping bags twisted and bunched rather than neatly arranged. Personal items scattered across the tent floor rather than packed in bags. A paperback book splayed open, pages bent beneath it as if dropped mid-sentence. But it was the far corner of the tent that caused the ranger's breath to catch in his throat. There, illuminated in the harsh beam of his flashlight, was a dark stain spreading across the synthetic fabric of the tent floor. Large, irregular, with smaller droplets surrounding it like satellite moons around a planet. The ranger had seen enough accidents in the wilderness to recognize the distinctive pattern and color of dried blood. His body responded before his conscious mind fully processed the implications. Heart rate spiking, pupils dilating, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. 23 years of training kicked in, his movements becoming automatic as he backed carefully out of the tent, disturbing the scene as little as possible. Outside in the daylight, he extracted his radio with steady hands that belied the adrenaline now coursing through his system. "Base, this is Sector 4. I've got an abandoned campsite approximately half a mile east of River Bridge on the Eastern Trail. Signs of distress, possible injury, no occupants visible. Blood evidence inside tent. Requesting backup and sheriff notification. Over." The response came through immediately, the dispatcher's voice tense with professional concern. "Copy Sector 4. What's your assessment of time frame?" Over. The ranger surveyed the scene again, this time with the methodical attention of someone gathering evidence. The dew on the scattered equipment had dried, but moisture still clung to shadowed areas. The blood inside was completely dry, not tacky. Food containers were open but showed no signs of animal intrusion, which would have occurred within hours if left unattended. Estimate abandonment within the last 12 to 24 hours. No wildlife disturbance yet. I've got clear drag marks leading toward the river. Going to conduct a preliminary perimeter search while maintaining site integrity. Over. Copy that. Sheriff and backup dispatched. ETA 40 minutes. Proceed with caution, Sector 4. Over. Understood. Sector 4 out. The ranger secured his radio, then extracted latex gloves from his pack. Part of the standard first aid kit, now repurposed for evidence preservation. He moved methodically around the perimeter of the site, careful to avoid the drag marks that led toward the river. His experienced eye caught details that might escape notice. A cell phone half hidden beneath fallen leaves, its screen shattered. A small digital camera, the lens cracked, partially submerged in a shallow puddle. Following standard procedure for potential crime scenes, he documented each discovery without disturbing the items themselves. 23 years in the service had included training for various scenarios, including potential criminal activity. Though rare in this remote region, the possibility couldn't be dismissed. The drag marks demanded attention. They continued approximately 30 yards toward the river before disappearing at the rocky shoreline. The ranger followed them to their termination point, scanning the water's edge and the opposite bank. The river ran swift here, deep in the center channel, with numerous rocks breaking the surface. If someone had entered the water, voluntarily or otherwise, he pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on observable evidence. No footprints on the opposite shore, though the rocky terrain would make them difficult to discern from this distance. No obvious disturbance in the vegetation that would indicate someone climbing out downstream. A glint of metal caught his eye, something wedged between rocks at the water's edge, partially submerged. He approached carefully, crouching to examine the object without touching it. A wristwatch, its leather strap torn, face cracked but still showing the time it had stopped. 2:17 a.m. or p.m., there was no way to determine. The ranger straightened, a heaviness settling in his chest that had nothing to do with physical exertion. In 23 years of service, he'd assisted in numerous search and rescue operations, had discovered hikers injured or lost or, occasionally, deceased from natural causes or accidents. But this scene spoke of something different, something that raised the hairs on the back of his neck despite the warmth of the day. The blood in the tent, the signs of struggle, the drag marks to the river, the abandoned personal effects that no hiker would willingly leave behind. He took a slow, deep breath, centering himself. Speculation would not serve him or whoever had occupied this camp. Facts, evidence, procedure, these were the tools of his profession, the framework that would guide what came next. With one last sweeping glance at the river, he turned back toward the campsite, his mind already constructing the report he would deliver to the sheriff upon arrival. Behind him, the water continued its relentless journey downstream, carrying with it whatever secrets it might have claimed in the dark hours of the previous night. The ranger maintained a vigilant perimeter around the site, marking boundaries with the emergency tape from his pack. Standard procedure dictated minimal disruption until proper authorities arrived, but there were preliminary steps he could take to preserve potential evidence. He retrieved additional equipment from his vehicle, a more comprehensive first aid kit that included additional gloves, evidence bags, and a digital SLR camera with better resolution than his tablet. The service had upgraded their documentation protocols 5 years ago after a high-profile case in the Western Territory had been compromised by insufficient initial evidence collection. Upon returning to the site, he began a more thorough photographic documentation, capturing wide establishing shots of the entire scene before moving to detailed images of specific elements, the drag marks, the scattered personal effects, the blood pattern inside the tent. Each image included a small-scale marker from his kit, providing reference for size and distance relationships. The ranger worked methodically, his movements deliberate and precise. Experience had taught him that initial impressions of a scene could be crucial, details that might be lost once multiple personnel arrived, inadvertently altering the site despite best efforts at preservation. The contents of the campsite told a partial story. The backpack contained high-end wilderness gear, waterproof matches, a satellite communicator that appeared damaged, topographical maps of the region with handwritten notations. The sleeping bags were rated for extreme cold, suggesting the occupants had planned for extended wilderness exposure. Food supplies indicated preparation for at least a week-long excursion. None of it aligned with typical tourist behavior. These weren't day hikers who had strayed off trail, nor inexperienced campers who had ignored signage. The equipment spoke of individuals with substantial outdoor experience, people who would understand and respect backcountry regulations. So why here, in a prohibited zone? And what had happened to transform an organized camp into this scene of apparent chaos? The ranger's contemplation was interrupted by the crackle of his radio. Sector 4, this is Sheriff Unit 5. We're approaching the Eastern Trail access point. Can you confirm your exact position? Over. The ranger provided precise coordinates and trail markers, then returned to his documentation while awaiting their arrival. 20 minutes later, he heard the distinctive sound of multiple sets of boots on the trail, the measured, purposeful stride of law enforcement rather than the variable rhythm of hikers. 3 figures emerged from the tree line: the county sheriff, a deputy, and one of the ranger's colleagues from the western sector. The sheriff, a veteran of rural law enforcement with 15 years in the county, nodded in recognition as he approached. They had worked together on various incidents over the years: missing hikers, wilderness injuries, occasional drug operations in the more remote sections of the park. "Ranger," the sheriff acknowledged, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of someone born and raised in the region. "What have we got?" The ranger provided a concise briefing, outlining his discovery and subsequent actions. He led them through the site, indicating points of interest without disturbing the evidence patterns. "No identification yet?" the sheriff asked, surveying the scattered belongings. "Nothing I could locate without deeper disturbance of the scene," the ranger replied. "There's a wallet visible inside the tent, but I left it in place once I observed the blood evidence." The sheriff nodded approvingly. "Good call. Deputies got the camera. Let's get this documented officially, then see about that wallet and any other ID." For the next hour, the site transformed into a carefully orchestrated investigation zone. The deputy photographed everything from multiple angles, while the sheriff and the ranger collaborated on a preliminary evidence inventory. The second ranger established a wider security perimeter and began scanning the surrounding forest for any additional evidence or potential witnesses, though in this remote section, other hikers would be unlikely. The wallet yielded driver's licenses for 2 individuals, a male and female, both in their early 30s, from a state approximately 300 miles south. The sheriff documented the information, then made a call to dispatch requesting background checks and emergency contact information. "Any sign of vehicle registration or car keys?" he asked, scanning the inventory they'd compiled. The ranger shook his head. "Nothing so far. They could have parked at any of 3 trailheads within a 5-mile radius." "We'll need to check them all," the sheriff said, making a note. "See if we can locate their vehicle. Might give us a better timeline." The discovery of the satellite communicator drew particular attention. The device was damaged, screen cracked, antenna broken, but potentially still contained valuable data. If they activated an emergency signal, it should have triggered an alert through the monitoring service, the ranger observed. "Unless the damage occurred before they could send one," the sheriff countered, examining the device without touching it. "We'll bag this for tech analysis, see if they can pull any data from it." As the investigation progressed, the ranger found himself repeatedly drawn to the drag marks leading to the river. Something about them nagged at his professional instincts. He'd seen drag marks before, evidence of hunters moving game, hikers transporting injured companions, even predators dragging prey. These were different, irregular, interrupted in places, with those distinctive handprints suggesting someone pulling themselves along rather than being pulled. "Sheriff," he called, gesturing toward the river, "I'd like your opinion on this." Together they followed the trail to its termination at the water's edge. The sheriff crouched, studying the pattern with the scrutiny of someone who had investigated numerous crime scenes over a long career. "Person was alive when they made these," he said finally, pointing to specific marks in the soil, the irregular spacing, the handprints, someone crawling, not being dragged by another person. "That's my read as well," the ranger agreed. "But then, what happened at the water? There's no sign of exit downstream as far as I could observe, and nothing visible on the opposite bank." The sheriff stood, squinting against the afternoon sun now reflecting off the water's surface. "River's running high after those rains. Current could have carried someone a considerable distance, especially if they were injured or unconscious." He unclipped his radio, requesting additional resources, a water search team, cadaver dogs for the shoreline. The word sent a chill through the ranger despite the warming day. The clinical terminology transformed the abstract situation into stark reality. They were likely searching for bodies now, not survivors. As the sheriff coordinated the expanded search operation, the ranger returned to the campsite, where the deputy was carefully cataloging items as they were placed in evidence bags. The tent had been thoroughly documented and was now being processed more invasively, the blood evidence sampled for later laboratory analysis. "Find anything else of note?" the ranger asked. The deputy nodded toward a small notebook that had been bagged and labeled. "Journal of some kind. Mostly observations about wildlife, trail conditions. Last entry was 3 days ago. Nothing indicating trouble. Mentions planning to document the northern caves the following day." The ranger frowned. "Northern caves? The only significant cave system is in the restricted research area. Completely off limits to the public has been for years." "Well, they were already camping in a prohibited zone," the deputy pointed out. "Maybe they were ignoring other restrictions too." The observation was reasonable, but something didn't sit right with the ranger. The level of wilderness experience evident in the equipment suggested people who would understand and respect conservation areas, even if they might bend rules about camping locations, unless they had specific reason to enter the restricted zone. The thought tugged at him as he helped process the remaining evidence. The cave system had been placed off-limits 5 years ago, after researchers had discovered a significant bat population, including several endangered species. The restriction had been well publicized in conservation circles. By late afternoon, the initial site processing was complete. Evidence had been collected, photographed, and prepared for transport. The expanded search teams had arrived and were beginning to work the river in both directions from the point where the drag marks ended. The sheriff approached the ranger as the last of the evidence was being loaded into the department's vehicle. "We've got a preliminary ID confirmation on our missing persons. No criminal records, both employed by Environmental Research Foundation. Foundation confirms they were on approved leave, but weren't specific about vacation plans. Environmental researchers," the ranger repeated, the pieces beginning to align in his mind. The journal mentioned northern caves. "They might have been conducting unauthorized research in our restricted zone." The sheriff considered this, frowning. "Potential motive for entering a prohibited area but doesn't explain." He gestured toward the processed site, the implication clear. Whatever had happened here went beyond simple trespassing. "I want to check the cave system," the ranger said firmly. "If they went there before returning to this camp, there might be evidence of what they encountered." The sheriff hesitated, clearly weighing jurisdictional considerations against investigative needs. "Not alone," he decided finally. "We'll send a team first thing tomorrow. Too close to dusk now to start another search area safely." The ranger knew he was right, but frustration gnawed at him nonetheless. The professional part of him recognized the wisdom in following proper procedure. The human part wanted answers, resolution, understanding of what had transformed an ordinary patrol into this grim investigation. As the light began to fade, operations wound down for the day. The water search would continue with specialized lighting equipment, but the ground teams would resume at first light. The sheriff departed with the collected evidence, headed for the county facility where it would be properly processed and analyzed. The ranger's colleague approached as the sheriff's vehicle disappeared down the service road. "You heading back to the station? Chief wants a full briefing." "Soon," the ranger replied, his gaze drawn back toward the river, now glittering darkly in the fading light. "I need a few minutes here first." Left alone at the scene, secured now with official crime scene tape and scheduled for overnight security patrols, the ranger felt the weight of the day settle fully upon him. 23 years in the service, and still the wilderness could reveal new horrors, new mysteries. He moved to the river's edge one last time, studying the water as it flowed relentlessly onward. Somewhere downstream could be answers, or bodies. Tomorrow would bring the cave investigation, potentially revealing what the missing researchers had discovered that might have led to this. As darkness claimed the forest, the ranger reluctantly returned to his vehicle. The drive back to the station would give him time to organize his thoughts, prepare his report, and brace himself for what tomorrow might reveal. One thing was certain. After 23 years of believing he understood the territory under his protection, he now faced the unsettling realization that the wilderness still held secrets capable of freezing the blood of even its most experienced guardians. Sleep would not come easily tonight. The ranger hadn't slept. The digital alarm clock on his nightstand displayed 4:17 a.m. in harsh red numerals when he finally abandoned the pretense of rest. His mind refused to relinquish the images from the previous day, the abandoned campsite, the blood-stained tent floor, those desperate drag marks leading to the water's edge. Dawn was still hours away, but sleep was a lost cause. He moved quietly through the darkened house, careful not to wake his wife or son. The coffee maker hummed to life under his practiced hands, its familiar gurgle providing an anchor of normalcy in what had become decidedly abnormal circumstances. While the coffee brewed, he reviewed his handwritten notes from yesterday's discovery. The researcher's interest in the northern caves kept drawing his attention. Why that specific location? The restricted area contained several cave systems, but the northern complex had been sealed off longest, nearly 5 years now, following the discovery of the endangered bat colony. Something about this detail nagged at him, a persistent splinter in his thoughts. By 5:30 a.m., he was driving toward the county records office. It wouldn't open until 8:00, but the ranger knew the morning clerk, a retired Park Service administrator who maintained a flexible schedule. A quick text message confirmed the clerk would meet him early, a professional courtesy between public servants. The county building stood at the edge of the small administrative township that serviced the region, its brutalist concrete architecture a stark contrast to the surrounding natural beauty. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered to life as the clerk led him through silent corridors to the basement archives. "Not often we get requests for the historical survey records," the clerk commented, keying in the access code to the climate-controlled room. "Especially not at this hour. Need background on the northern cave system," the ranger explained briefly. "Possible connection to an ongoing investigation." The clerk nodded, professional curiosity evident but restrained. "Survey materials from before the digital transition are in Section C, rows 15 through 20. Environmental reports are in the adjacent cabinets. Sign-out sheets are by the door if you remove anything." Left alone in the repository of regional history, the ranger began his methodical search. The room housed decades of reports, surveys, and administrative records predating the digital archiving system implemented 12 years ago. Cardboard boxes and acid-free folders lined metal shelving units, each labeled with meticulous precision. He located the environmental surveys first, focusing on reports dating from 5 to 10 years prior. The official documentation on the bat colony discovery and subsequent restriction order were thorough, but revealed nothing beyond what he already knew. Standard conservation protocol, properly executed and documented. Moving deeper into the archives, he shifted focus to geological surveys and historical land usage records. 3 hours into his search, hunched over a desk scattered with opened files, the ranger discovered the first anomalous document. A survey report from 15 years ago that made brief reference to unusual mineral deposits in the northern cave system. The notation was flagged for follow-up, but subsequent reports contained no further mention of these findings. Strange, but not necessarily significant. Budget constraints often resulted in recommended follow-ups being deprioritized or abandoned entirely. Still, he photographed the document with his phone, adding it to his growing collection of potentially relevant information. The breakthrough came shortly before noon, buried in a box containing miscellaneous correspondence between the Park Service and various research institutions. A folder labeled Project Limestone, Terminated, contained a series of letters dated 14 years ago, documenting a proposed research partnership between the Park Service and a geochemical research facility based in the state capital. The initial letters outlined an ambitious study of unique mineral formations discovered in the northern cave system, with specific interest in their potential applications. Subsequent correspondence grew increasingly terse, culminating in an abrupt termination notice from Park Service headquarters, citing classification concerns and security protocols. The ranger frowned, examining the signatures. The termination notice bore the authorization of the regional director from that era, a man who had retired shortly thereafter. No specific justification was provided, just bureaucratic language effectively shutting down the project. He photographed every document in the folder, then continued searching, now with a more specific target. The search yielded little additional information until he discovered a thin manila envelope tucked between larger files in a box of administrative miscellany. Inside was a single photograph, a geological specimen labeled only with a date and Northern Complex Chamber 3. The mineral sample in the image was unlike anything the ranger had seen in his decades of wilderness experience. Crystalline in structure, but with an unusual bluish-green coloration that seemed to emit a subtle luminescence despite the poor quality of the photograph. On the back of the photograph, a handwritten note read, "Sample transferred to facility as per protocol. Site secured pending classification determination." The ranger sat back, pieces beginning to align in his mind. The environmental researchers found in the abandoned camp might have stumbled upon whatever had triggered the abrupt termination of Project Limestone 14 years ago. Something significant enough to warrant immediate security protocols, but somehow lost in the administrative shuffle over the intervening years. His next step was clear. Before joining the scheduled investigation of the cave system, he needed to examine the administrative site referenced in the records, a small research outpost established at the entrance to the northern caves during the initial Project Limestone work. According to the documents, the facility had been maintained as a monitoring station after the project's termination, but budget cuts 8 years ago had resulted in its decommissioning. The ranger checked out of the archives, thanking the clerk who raised an eyebrow at the extended duration of the visit but asked no questions. Professional courtesy again. In small communities like this, interdepartmental cooperation functioned on unspoken understanding and mutual respect. The drive to the decommissioned research outpost took nearly an hour on service roads rarely traveled since the area's restriction. Vegetation had begun to reclaim the narrow access path, branches scraping against the vehicle as he navigated the final approach. The facility itself came into view as he rounded a bend, a modest, prefabricated structure nestled against the rocky hillside that concealed the cave entrance. Time and neglect had taken their toll. The metal exterior had succumbed to rust in places, windows were clouded with grime or cracked from weather exposure, and the surrounding area was overgrown with native vegetation. A chain-link fence encircled the compound, a padlocked gate securing the entrance. The lock showed signs of recent use, no rust accumulation, the mechanism clean compared to the weathered chain it secured. The ranger documented this detail with his phone before using his service keys to access the compound. Standard protocol granted senior rangers master access to all service facilities, even decommissioned ones, for emergency management purposes. Inside the perimeter, signs of recent activity became more evident. A narrow path had been trampled through the overgrowth leading to the main building entrance. Boot prints in the accumulated soil showed multiple individuals had visited the site within the past week, consistent with the time frame of the missing researchers. The main door yielded to another service key, hinges protesting as it swung inward to reveal a space frozen in administrative abandonment. Dust-covered furniture remained positioned as if awaiting the return of long-departed staff. Filing cabinets stood against walls, some with drawers partially open. Defunct computer equipment occupied desks, relics of an earlier technological era. But here, too, evidence of recent disturbance was apparent. Finger tracks through dust on cabinets, footprints across otherwise undisturbed floors. The ranger moved methodically through the building, documenting everything with his phone's camera. The research station situated in the rear of the facility told the most compelling story. While most equipment had been removed during decommissioning, basic infrastructure remained. Specialized ventilation systems, reinforced workbenches, sample storage units designed for geological specimens. Several storage units showed signs of recent opening, their contents apparently removed. A doorway at the rear of the research area led to a short tunnel carved directly into the hillside, the access point to the cave system itself. Heavy steel doors, incongruous against the natural rock, sealed the entrance. Unlike the facility behind him, these showed no sign of deterioration, clearly designed for long-term security rather than temporary research needs. A modern electronic keypad controlled the locking mechanism, its sleek design at odds with the aging facility around it. More significantly, it appeared to be active, small status lights indicating power where the rest of the facility had been disconnected years ago. Someone had restored independent power to the security system, bypassing the decommissioned grid. The ranger documented this final anomaly before exiting the facility, securing it behind him. The scheduled cave investigation with the sheriff's department would begin in 2 hours. What he'd discovered would significantly alter the parameters of that operation and raise disturbing questions about what the missing researchers might have encountered in the darkness beyond those steel doors. The ranger arrived at the designated meeting point 20 minutes early, using the time to organize his findings into a coherent briefing. The sheriff's department had assembled a 4-person team: the sheriff himself, 2 deputies with wilderness training, and a forensic technician. The Park Service was represented by the ranger and his supervisor, a 27-year veteran who had driven in from regional headquarters after being notified of the situation. Before we proceed, there's additional context you need to be aware of, the ranger began, addressing the assembled team. He outlined his morning's discoveries: the terminated research project, the unusual mineral samples, and the recently accessed facility. The sheriff's expression darkened as the briefing progressed. So these researchers might have been after whatever this Project Limestone found years ago? It appears likely, the ranger confirmed. Their journal mentioned documenting the northern caves specifically. Given their environmental research background, they may have used the bat colony study as cover for accessing the restricted area. The question remains what happened afterward, the supervisor interjected. Whatever they found or didn't find, something drove them back to their campsite in a state of apparent panic. The forensic technician, who had been processing evidence from the abandoned campsite, provided an update. Preliminary blood analysis confirms it's human, belonging to at least one of our missing persons. Quantity suggests serious injury, but not necessarily fatal trauma. This somber assessment hung over the group as they finalized their approach. The decision was made to access the cave system through the research facility, rather than the natural entrance further north. The ranger would lead, accompanied by the sheriff and one deputy. The supervisor, remaining deputy, and technician would maintain a communication base at the facility. 40 minutes later, the ranger stood before the steel doors he had documented earlier, now with the sheriff and deputy at his side. Each was equipped with standard spelunking gear, helmets with mounted lights, backup illumination, emergency supplies, and communication equipment that would function within the limited range the cave system allowed. The electronic keypad presented the first challenge. Without access codes, forced entry would be their only option. The sheriff was preparing to radio for the equipment when the ranger noticed a small envelope taped to the underside of the control panel, visible only from a specific angle. Inside was a handwritten sequence of numbers, not an official access document, but likely left by the researchers for their own use. Worth a try, the sheriff suggested. The ranger input the sequence, and the mechanism responded with a soft click and the hiss of a pressure seal releasing. The heavy doors slid aside, revealing a short constructed tunnel leading to the natural cave entrance. Motion-activated lights illuminated as they proceeded, another indication of recent restoration of systems. The constructed passageway gave way to natural cave formations approximately 50 yards in. Here, the true scale of the northern complex became apparent. A vast chamber with ceiling heights exceeding 30 feet in places, walls glistening with mineral deposits that caught and reflected their helmet lights. The air was cool and damp, carrying the distinctive musty scent of deep cave systems. Main bat colony is supposed to be in the eastern branches, the ranger noted, consulting the digital map on his tablet. Project Limestone documentation mentioned their primary interest was in Chamber 3, northwest of our position. They proceeded carefully, documenting as they went. The cave floor showed clear signs of recent foot traffic, multiple sets of prints visible in the soft sediment. The path led deeper into the system, following a gradually descending tunnel that branched off from the main chamber. 200 yards in, they discovered the first sign of the researchers' presence, a small digital camera tripod positioned near a distinctive rock formation. The camera itself was missing, but a memory card had been left in a waterproof case attached to the tripod leg. The sheriff bagged the evidence while the ranger examined nearby formations with growing concern. The rock surfaces displayed unusual characteristics, crystalline structures similar to those in the archive photograph, with the same distinctive bluish-green coloration. More disturbing was the apparent growth pattern. These formations were significantly larger and more extensive than those documented 14 years prior, suggesting some form of expansion over time. "I've never seen geological formations like these," the sheriff commented, directing his light toward a particularly dense cluster. "They almost look organic." The observation sent an involuntary chill through the ranger. The formations did indeed suggest biological growth patterns rather than typical mineral accumulation. He documented the structures extensively, including close-up images of what appeared to be recent sampling points, small areas where material had been precisely removed with cutting tools. The path continued deeper, leading them to a narrow passage that opened into what could only be Chamber 3 from the original documentation. Here, the unusual formations dominated the space, covering nearly 60% of the available surfaces. The coloration was more intense, the luminescent quality noticeable even without direct illumination. Near the center of the chamber, they discovered an abandoned research kit, specimen containers, collection tools, a digital tablet in a protective case, and a high-resolution camera. All appeared to have been discarded hastily, some equipment still powered on despite depleted batteries. The ranger accessed the tablet, finding it unlocked. The most recent files included detailed photographs of the formations, specimen analysis notes, and a video recording dated the day before the campsite was abandoned. He played the recording for the group. The footage showed one of the researchers, presumably the male identified from the driver's license, examining a particularly large formation. His voice narrated observations about accelerated growth patterns and unusual spectroscopic readings before the camera panned to show his colleague taking samples nearby. The video ended abruptly with a distant rumbling sound and looks of concern from both subjects. Further exploration of the chamber revealed a passage at the far end that had been partially blocked by a cave-in, recent, judging by the fresh rock debris and undisturbed dust. The configuration suggested the collapse had occurred from the other side, potentially the source of the rumbling captured in the video. There's something beyond this point they were trying to reach, the ranger observed, examining the blockage without disturbing it. Something significant enough to risk entering a restricted area. The sheriff nodded grimly, and potentially significant enough to get them killed after they found it. They spent another hour documenting Chamber 3, collecting samples of the unusual formations for analysis, and gathering all abandoned research equipment. The ranger copied all data from the tablet and camera to his own devices before bagging them as evidence. Redundancy that would prove crucial in the events that followed. The team emerged from the cave system as dusk approached, the daylight fading rapidly behind the western mountains. The base team had maintained regular communication throughout the exploration, but the full impact of their discoveries only became apparent during the comprehensive debriefing at the facility. These formations don't match any known geological profile, the forensic technician stated after preliminary examination of the samples. I'd need specialized equipment for proper analysis, but the structure appears to incorporate both mineral and organic components. The researchers' notes suggest they came specifically looking for these formations, the ranger added, reviewing the copied data. References to previous studies, spectrographic analysis consistent with something they'd seen before. The supervisor frowned, studying the images displayed on the ranger's tablet. None of this was in any official record accessible to civilians. How would they know what to look for? It was a disturbing question with no immediate answer. The sheriff ordered all evidence transported to the county facility for processing, with priority notifications to state-level environmental and scientific authorities. The cave system was to remain sealed, with regular patrols established around the perimeter. The ranger returned to his station outpost well after midnight, exhaustion finally overtaking the adrenaline that had sustained him throughout the day. He secured his personal copies of the data in the station safe, then drove home through the darkened forest, the headlights carving a narrow path through the encompassing wilderness. The house was quiet when he arrived, his family long asleep. He moved through the familiar space with practiced ease, avoiding the creaking floorboard in the hallway, checking that his son's door was closed as he passed. These small domestic rituals grounded him after hours immersed in increasingly disturbing mystery. Sleep came swiftly but proved short-lived. He awoke at first light, mind already processing the previous day's discoveries. Over breakfast, he avoided his wife's concerned questions with reassurances about complicated work situations, technically true, but profoundly inadequate. At the station, he found the first warning. The envelope had been slipped under the station door sometime overnight, blank except for his official title handwritten on the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a typed message. Some secrets should remain buried. You've seen enough. Stop now. The ranger secured the note as evidence, then checked the station's security systems. The cameras had been disabled between 2:14 and 2:17 a.m., a precise 3-minute window that spoke of planning and expertise rather than opportunistic vandalism. He reported the incident to both Park Service headquarters and the Sheriff's Department, initiating formal threat assessment protocols. Hours later, he received the second disturbing development. The evidence transported to the county facility had been compromised overnight. The sheriff reported a sophisticated break-in targeting only materials from the cave investigation. The tablet, camera, and geological samples were gone. Security footage showed nothing. Sensors had been temporarily disabled using county access codes. The ranger immediately checked the station safe. His backup data remained secure, the only surviving evidence of what they'd discovered. He transferred everything to encrypted drives, creating multiple copies to be distributed among trusted contacts. The meeting with the sheriff that afternoon did little to alleviate growing concerns. They gathered in a neutral location, a diner 30 miles from both the park and county facilities, to compare notes on the rapidly escalating situation. County administrator is pressuring me to classify this as routine vandalism and close the case, the sheriff revealed, voice low despite the private booth and ambient noise. Got a call from the state office this morning expressing concern about resource allocation. Bureaucratic speak for back off. Same pressure from regional headquarters, the ranger confirmed. Supervisors been redirected to a priority assignment across state. I'm being strongly encouraged to take accumulated leave effective immediately. Someone's working hard to bury this, the sheriff observed, stirring his untouched coffee. Question is, who has the influence to coordinate across multiple agencies this efficiently? The answer emerged partially through an unexpected ally. As they were leaving the diner, a young deputy, recently transferred to the county from a neighboring jurisdiction, approached with evident nervousness. "Sir, I shouldn't be telling you this," the deputy began, eyes constantly scanning the parking lot as he addressed the sheriff. "But the samples you brought in, before they disappeared, I helped the tech log them. The readings were unlike anything he'd seen. Some kind of radiation signature that didn't match standard profiles." "What happened to the preliminary reports?" the sheriff asked. "Deleted from the system. Tech was told it was a classification error, and to forget what he saw." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. He's worked there 15 years, never seen anything handled this way. Said to tell you it reminded him of the Carson Ridge incident from 2018. The Carson Ridge reference sent a chill through the ranger. That case had involved unexplained wildlife deaths near a decommissioned military research facility. An investigation abruptly terminated through federal intervention and subsequently buried under classification protocols. The deputy departed quickly, leaving the ranger and sheriff with troubling new context. Whatever the researchers had discovered in the cave system had triggered intervention at levels far beyond local authority, possibly extending to federal agencies with classification power. Confirmation arrived the following morning in the form of a second note, this one left on the windshield of the ranger's personal vehicle parked in his home driveway. A deliberate escalation demonstrating knowledge of his residence and family. The message was more explicit. "We know about your backup data. We know about your family. The northern caves are now under federal jurisdiction. This is your final warning." The violation of his personal space, the implicit threat to his family, should have intimidated. Instead, it crystallized the ranger's resolve. 23 years of service had instilled a profound sense of responsibility to the land under his protection, to the truth of what occurred within it, and to the public trust his position represented. He made 3 calls that morning. The first to his wife, arranging for her and their son to visit her sister in another state. A planned trip moved forward under the guise of school scheduling changes. The second to a trusted colleague at the State Environmental Protection Office, arranging secure transfer of 1 copy of his evidence files. The third call went to a national investigative journalist known for coverage of environmental and governmental oversight issues. The conversation was brief, encrypted, and ended with arrangements for a secure meeting the following day. That evening, as he prepared his presentation of evidence and testimony, the ranger heard a vehicle approaching the station. Through the window, he observed an unmarked black SUV with government plates parking in the otherwise empty lot. 2 men in suits emerged, their bearing and movement patterns instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with federal agencies. The ranger secured his remaining evidence copy and exited through the station's rear emergency door, disappearing into the forest he knew better than any official, regardless of jurisdiction level. The wilderness that had been his professional domain for 23 years now offered protection as he navigated the darkened landscape. Tomorrow would bring the meeting with the journalist. The first step in ensuring the truth about the northern caves and the missing researchers would not remain buried. Whatever consequences followed, professional, personal, or legal, paled against the implications of what they had discovered. Some secrets deserved to remain hidden. This, he had become convinced, was not one of them. The night enveloped him as he moved silently through the trees, a shadow among shadows, heading toward the predetermined safe location. Behind him, lights swept across the station windows as the federal agents discovered his absence. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the pursuit of truth that had become his final, most important mission. Dawn broke with unnatural stillness over the isolated cabin. The ranger had chosen this location carefully, a maintenance outpost in the eastern sector, rarely used since budget cuts had reduced staffing. Its existence was documented in official records, but its exact coordinates were often misreported due to an administrative error never corrected. A small advantage, but potentially crucial in the hours ahead. Inside, he methodically prepared for what might be the most important day of his 23-year career. The backpack laid open on the rough wooden table contained only essential items, each selected with purpose. 2 high-capacity external batteries for his phone and camera, a handheld GPS unit with topographical data preloaded, water purification tablets, emergency rations, first aid supplies, a thermal blanket, his service weapon, officially signed out for wildlife protection during remote patrols. He checked each item with the precision of someone who understood that wilderness survival often hinged on preparation. The satellite phone, his own, not service-issued, would be his lifeline if standard communications failed. He tested it, confirming the signal strength before returning it to the waterproof case. The ranger paused, eyes falling on the sealed envelope propped against the cabin's lone lamp. Inside was a detailed account of everything he'd discovered about the northern caves, the missing researchers, and the apparent cover-up that followed. Names, dates, locations, all documented with the same meticulous attention he'd applied to wildlife surveys and incident reports throughout his career. Beside the envelope sat a small digital recorder containing a verbal statement covering the same information. Both were addressed to his wife, with instructions to forward them to specific contacts if he failed to return or make contact within 24 hours. The thought of his family sent a pang through his chest. They had departed yesterday afternoon, his wife confused but trusting his judgment when he insisted on the sudden visit to her sister. Their son had complained about missing weekend plans with friends. Normal, mundane concerns that now seemed precious in their ordinariness. His preparations were interrupted by the subtle vibration of his phone, a text message from the environmental officer he'd contacted confirming receipt of the secure data package. One of 3 backups now distributed to trusted contacts. Whatever happened next, the evidence would survive. The ranger moved to the cabin's single window, scanning the surrounding forest as morning light filtered through the canopy. No sign of surveillance, but that meant little. The federal agents who had arrived at the station last night would have access to resources beyond obvious ground teams, satellite monitoring, drone surveillance, communication interception. His advantage was intimate knowledge of the terrain and decades of experience moving through wilderness undetected. The journalist had agreed to meet at noon in a public location 50 miles south, a regional farmers market in a town large enough to provide anonymity, but small enough to make surveillance operations conspicuous. Before that meeting, however, the ranger had one final location to investigate. The topographical maps had revealed a detail he'd overlooked in initial reviews, a secondary access point to the deeper sections of the northern cave system. Not through the research facility they'd explored, but via an older mining tunnel documented in surveys from 30 years ago. The tunnel had been officially sealed after being deemed structurally unsound, but if the unusual formations extended throughout the system as the evidence suggested, this alternate entrance might reveal critical information about their true nature and extent. More significantly, this entrance would likely not be monitored if federal authorities were focused on the main research facility. A calculated risk, but one that might provide the final pieces of evidence needed to break through the wall of official denial and classified secrecy. The ranger packed the last of his supplies, then sat at the table to record a final video message on his personal device. The camera captured his face, weathered from decades outdoors, lined with fatigue from sleepless nights, but resolute in purpose. "If you're viewing this, it means I haven't returned or made contact as scheduled," he began, voice steady. "Everything I've documented about the northern caves and the missing researchers is true to the best of my knowledge. I'm proceeding with this final investigation because the public deserves the truth about what's happening in protected wilderness under federal jurisdiction." He detailed his planned route, the precautions taken, and the arrangements made for evidence preservation. The message concluded with brief personal statements to his wife and son, not goodbye, but acknowledgement of the risk he was undertaking. The ranger secured the device with the envelope, then placed both in the prearranged location where his colleague would find them if necessary. With a final check of his equipment, he shouldered the pack and stepped into the morning light. The old mining access point was a 3-hour hike through difficult terrain. If he maintained pace, he would have approximately 2 hours for investigation before needing to depart for the meeting with the journalist. As he disappeared into the tree line, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone at home in the wilderness, the ranger felt a strange sense of clarity. For 23 years he had served as guardian and protector of this land. Today, that duty extended beyond maintaining trails or managing wildlife. Today, it meant uncovering the truth, no matter the personal cost. The abandoned mining entrance was exactly where historical surveys had indicated, a horizontal shaft cut into the hillside, partially concealed by decades of vegetative growth. The original timber supports had rotted and collapsed in sections, but the tunnel itself remained structurally intact, carved through solid bedrock by miners searching for copper deposits long since depleted. The ranger documented the entrance with his camera before activating his headlamp and proceeding inside. The air grew cool and damp within yards of the entrance, carrying the distinctive musty scent of underground spaces long undisturbed. His light revealed boot prints in the soft earth, recent, within days rather than weeks. Someone had accessed this entrance since the last rainfall. He advanced carefully, documenting as he went. The tunnel extended approximately 200 yards before intersecting with a natural cave formation, part of the same system they had explored through the research facility, but a different section according to his topographical reference. The ranger paused at this junction, examining the rock walls with focused attention. There, the first traces of the unusual formations, smaller than those documented in Chamber 3, but unmistakably the same crystalline structures with their distinctive bluish-green coloration. He photographed them extensively, noting that these specimens appeared to be growing along the seams where the artificial tunnel met the natural cave wall, as if the mining activity had exposed something previously contained within the stone itself. The natural passage descended at a steeper angle than the mining tunnel, requiring careful navigation over slick surfaces. The ranger secured a thin guide rope to assist his return journey before continuing downward. As he descended, the formations became more prevalent, covering increasingly larger sections of the cave walls with their luminescent structures. 300 yards in, the passage opened into a chamber significantly larger than those documented during the previous expedition. The ranger's headlamp couldn't illuminate the full extent of the space, the beam disappearing into darkness above and beyond. He activated his secondary light sources, revealing a scene that momentarily froze him in place. The chamber was dominated by the crystalline formations, no longer isolated patches, but fully integrated structures covering almost every surface. The bluish-green luminescence was strong enough here to provide ambient light, pulsing with subtle rhythmic variations that suggested something beyond simple mineral phosphorescence. The effect created an otherworldly environment, beautiful and deeply unsettling simultaneously. Most disturbing were the forms the structures had taken in this deeper chamber. No longer simple crystalline growths, they had developed into complex, almost sculptural configurations that bore unsettling resemblances to biological structures. Branching patterns like vascular systems, spherical clusters like cellular formations, elongated structures reminiscent of vertebrae. The ranger documented everything with methodical precision despite his growing unease. These formations appeared to be evolving, adapting, developing complexity beyond anything explainable through standard geological processes. If the samples in Chamber 3 had suggested unusual growth patterns, these confirmed a progression that defied conventional scientific categorization. Near the center of the chamber, he discovered what the researchers had likely been seeking: a depression in the floor approximately 20 feet in diameter, filled with a viscous, semi-translucent substance that shared the same bluish-green luminescence as the surrounding formations. The surface rippled slightly despite the absence of any air movement, suggesting internal motion or activity. The ranger approached cautiously, maintaining safe distance while documenting the phenomenon. At the edge of the depression, he found equipment that confirmed the researchers had reached this location: specialized collection tools, sample containers, and a high-resolution spectrometer. Several sample containers were filled with the luminescent substance, carefully sealed and labeled with scientific nomenclature beyond his expertise. Most significantly, he found a waterproof field notebook containing observations and preliminary analysis. The final entry, dated the day before their campsite was abandoned, contained a single sentence that sent a chill through him: confirmation of biological activity in mineral substrate. The implications are beyond anything we anticipated. The ranger photographed each page of the notebook, then secured it in his pack, along with 2 of the sealed sample containers. This was the evidence they had been searching for, the discovery that had led to the researchers' apparent flight and subsequent disappearance. As he completed his documentation, a sound from the passage behind him froze the ranger in mid-motion. The unmistakable scrape of boots on stone, too deliberate to be falling debris. He wasn't alone in the cave system. The ranger extinguished his primary light, leaving only the ambient glow of the formations to illuminate the space. Moving with practiced stealth, he positioned himself behind a large rock formation near the chamber entrance, camera and evidence secure in his pack. Lights appeared in the passage, multiple beams sweeping methodically across the chamber entrance. Three figures emerged, wearing what appeared to be specialized hazardous material suits with full face protection. They carried advanced scientific equipment and what the ranger recognized as military-grade weapons, not standard issue for any environmental or research personnel he'd encountered in 23 years of service. Their communications were muffled by their equipment, but fragments reached his position. Full containment protocol. Expansion rate increased by 17%. Samples for Facility 7. Termination order for breach confirmed. The ranger remained motionless as they proceeded toward the central depression, deploying equipment around its perimeter. Their focus on the task provided the opportunity he needed. With the discipline of decades spent moving silently through wilderness, he eased away from his position and toward a secondary passage he'd noted during his initial survey, a narrow tunnel leading away from the main chamber at an upward angle. He'd nearly reached the passage when a shower of small stones dislodged from above, clattering across the cave floor with unmistakable sound. One of the suited figures spun immediately, light beam finding the ranger in the same moment. A voice barked, "Containment breach! Subject identified!" What followed was pure instinct. The ranger bolted for the secondary passage as the chamber erupted with shouts and the distinctive sound of weapons being readied. The narrow tunnel forced him into a hunched position, moving as rapidly as possible through a space barely wide enough for his frame. Behind him, lights and voices pursued, the suited figures hampered by their protective equipment in the confined space. The passage ascended sharply, twisting through the bedrock in a natural chimney formation. The ranger's knowledge of cave systems guided his choices at each junction. Always up, always toward potential surface access, rather than deeper into the system. His pursuers fell behind in the narrowest sections but maintained vocal contact, their communications now clearly focused on securing the subject and recovering compromised materials. 20 minutes of intense physical exertion brought him to a chamber where natural light filtered through a narrow fissure above, a potential exit point. The opening was tight, requiring him to remove his pack and push it through ahead of him before squeezing his body through the constriction. Sharp rock edges tore at his clothing and scraped skin from his shoulders, but adrenaline muted the pain as he emerged onto a steep, vegetated hillside, approximately half a mile from his entry point. No time for relief. The ranger secured his pack and immediately began navigating downslope, using the dense vegetation as cover while maintaining maximum sustainable pace. Years of wilderness experience translated into efficient movement, distributing weight to minimize sound, selecting routes that left minimal trace, using natural features to break line of sight. Behind him, radio communications became audible. His pursuers had coordinated with ground teams, deploying in a standard search pattern to intercept his likely exit routes. The ranger altered course, moving perpendicular to the expected pattern, sacrificing speed for stealth as he navigated toward the service road where he had concealed his personal vehicle. The forest that had been his professional domain for 23 years now served as ally and protector. He recognized subtle game trails invisible to less experienced eyes, anticipated terrain features before encountering them, sensed changes in vegetation that indicated water sources or geological transitions. Every aspect of the environment provided information that guided his escape. 3 hours of sustained evasion brought him within sight of the service road. The ranger paused, conducting a careful survey before proceeding. No vehicles visible, no signs of personnel deployed along the access point. Still, caution dictated a final approach through the densest available cover, moving in short bursts with observation pauses between. The vehicle remained undiscovered, concealed beneath the camouflage tarp he'd deployed before departing. The ranger performed a rapid but thorough inspection. No signs of tampering, tracking devices, or surveillance equipment. He secured his pack in the locked compartment beneath the rear seat, changed into the civilian clothing stored there, then departed via the service road at precisely the speed limit. The adrenaline that had sustained him throughout the escape began to ebb as he navigated toward the arranged meeting point, replaced by hypervigilance that registered every vehicle, every helicopter sound, every potential surveillance point along the route. Multiple course changes and a vehicle switch at a predetermined location. His colleague's truck, left with keys concealed as arranged, provided additional security as he approached the farmer's market where the journalist waited. The evidence was intact, the sample secured, the documentation complete. Now came the crucial transfer that would ensure the truth about the northern caves would reach the public, regardless of what happened to him personally. The farmer's market bustled with weekend activity. local producers displaying harvest yields, artisans selling crafts, families browsing stalls in the autumn sunshine. The normality of the scene created surreal contrast with the events of the past hours, a reminder of the ordinary world that continued unaware of what lurked beneath the wilderness 30 miles north. The ranger spotted the journalist immediately. Female, mid-40s, with the alert posture of someone accustomed to high-stress situations. She sat at a corner table of an outdoor cafe adjacent to the market, position selected for maximum visibility of approaching figures, while maintaining proximity to multiple exit routes. Professional paranoia that matched his own. No words were exchanged as he took the seat opposite her. The flash drive containing all documentation passed from hand to hand beneath the table, concealed by the casual movement of accepting the coffee she had waiting. "Everything as we discussed?" she asked, voice casual while her eyes continuously scanned their surroundings. "Plus physical samples," the ranger confirmed. "Notebook and biological material from the site. Chain of custody documented in the files." She nodded once, professional acknowledgement rather than gratitude. "Copies distributed as discussed? 3 locations. Contacts will release if either of us fails to provide the scheduled confirmation signals." The journalist sipped her coffee, posture relaxed while her eyes remained vigilant. "Initial publication in 36 hours. Full documentation release synchronized across 6 outlets in 4 countries. After that, impossible to contain regardless of jurisdiction or classification." The ranger provided additional context in measured tones, outlining the confrontation in the cave system and the apparent scale of the operation. The journalist recorded nothing, asked no questions, simply absorbed the information with the focused attention of someone trained to retain complex details. Their meeting concluded in less than 15 minutes. The journalist departed first, the flash drive and documentation now secured in her possession. The ranger remained at the table, monitoring the market for another 30 minutes before leaving through a service alley that provided excellent visibility of potential surveillance positions. For the next 36 hours, he maintained constant movement, never staying in one location for more than 2 hours, using only cash for transactions, avoiding surveillance cameras where possible. The burner phone purchased at a highway convenience store provided the secure channel for confirming the safety of his family and receiving updates from his trusted contacts. At precisely 8:00 a.m. on the second day, the story broke simultaneously across multiple platforms. The journalist had constructed a masterpiece of investigative reporting, factual, detailed, substantiated with documentary evidence and expert analysis of the samples he had provided. The headlines varied by outlet, but carried the same essential message. Classified biological discovery concealed in national wilderness. Government cover-up of unknown biological entity in protected caves. Missing researchers expose deadly secret in northern cave system. By noon, the story had been picked up by major networks. By evening, satellite trucks lined the main road leading to the park entrance, held at distance by hastily established security perimeters. Statements from various agencies followed the predictable pattern. Initial denial, followed by acknowledgement of investigating the allegations, culminating in the announcement of a task force to examine potential research irregularities. From the safety of a motel room 50 miles from the unfolding media circus, the ranger watched the coverage with grim satisfaction. The journalist had protected his identity as promised, attributing the evidence to multiple sources within environmental protection agencies. His professional reputation and personal security remained intact, though he harbored no illusions about the eventual discovery of his involvement. On the third day, the response escalated dramatically. Helicopter footage captured the arrival of what news outlets identified as specialized federal hazardous materials teams, advanced scientific personnel, and military security units. The entire northern section of the park was declared temporarily closed due to environmental hazard assessment procedures. The ranger's phone vibrated with a message from the journalist. Federal science advisor requesting secure meeting with primary source. Claims significant public safety concerns beyond current reporting. Verified legitimate through 3 channels. Your call. The decision required minimal consideration. If genuine public safety concerns existed, his duty remained the same as it had been for 23 years. Protection of both the wilderness and the people who inhabited the surrounding regions. The meeting occurred at a federal office in the state capital, arranged through secure channels with guarantees of immunity from prosecution. The science advisor, a distinguished researcher with decades of relevant experience, provided a comprehensive briefing that filled the final gaps in the Rangers' understanding. The formations in the northern caves were indeed a previously undocumented biological entity, not extraterrestrial as some media outlets had speculated, but terrestrial in origin, a hybrid organism existing at the intersection of mineral and biological domains. Ancient, dormant for millennia until mining activities had breached its containment, now experiencing accelerated growth due to environmental changes and human interference. Project Limestone had discovered its existence 14 years ago, but lacking proper understanding, had inadvertently stimulated its growth phase through sampling and testing. The classification and containment that followed was motivated not by sinister conspiracy, but by legitimate concern about potential ecological impact if the organism continued expanding beyond the cave system. The missing researchers had indeed discovered the truth, but contrary to media speculation, they were alive, currently in isolation at a specialized medical facility, being treated for exposure effects that, while not immediately life-threatening, required careful monitoring and treatment. "We handled it badly," the science advisor admitted. "Classification rather than consultation, secrecy rather than scientific collaboration, the instinct to contain and control rather than understand. Your actions, while technically violations of multiple regulations, have created the transparency that should have existed from the beginning." 1 week after the initial exposure, the Ranger stood on the overlook above the valley, watching as specialized equipment was transported along the service road toward the northern caves. The operation now proceeded in full public view, with daily briefings and independent scientific oversight. The media encampment had diminished as the sensational aspects gave way to the methodical reality of scientific investigation, but public attention remained focused on both the biological discovery and the governmental processes that had failed to handle it appropriately. His professional status remained in administrative limbo, neither officially sanctioned nor formally disciplined. The supervisor had returned, offering oblique congratulations masked as procedural reminders about chain-of-command concerns. The sheriff had been more direct during their brief encounter at the local diner. "Damned brave thing you did. Damned foolish too, but necessary." As sunset painted the landscape in amber hues, the Ranger's phone vibrated with a message from his wife. "Coming home tomorrow. Proud of you." 23 years of service had taught him that wilderness held both beauty and danger, often intertwined in ways that defied simple categorization. The northern caves had revealed yet another layer of that complex truth, and reminded him that the most important aspect of his duty had always been bearing witness, regardless of personal cost. The discovery in the abandoned tent had indeed frozen everyone in horror, not through supernatural terror or human malevolence, but through the profound realization that the natural world still contained wonders and perils beyond current scientific understanding. In exposing that truth, the Ranger had fulfilled his most fundamental obligation as guardian of both the wilderness and the public trust. He turned from the overlook and headed home, leaving behind the temporary chaos of media attention and federal operations. The investigation would continue without him now, proceeding in the daylight of public scrutiny rather than the darkness of classified secrecy. Some horrors needed to be faced directly. Some discoveries, no matter how frightening their implications, demanded acknowledgement rather than concealment. After 23 years, the Ranger had made the choice that defined not just his career, but the fundamental purpose that had drawn him to this profession in the first place: to protect, to preserve, and above all, to bear honest witness to the true nature of the wilderness under his care. 3 months after the initial media exposure, winter had fully claimed the wilderness. Snow blanketed the landscape, transforming familiar terrain into an austere monochrome canvas. The northern section of the park remained closed to the public, the perimeter now marked with permanent structures rather than temporary barriers, concession to the reality that some areas might never reopen. The Ranger watched from his station window as another convoy of specialized vehicles navigated the access road, their purpose no longer concealed behind classification and denial. Transparency had become the operational standard following congressional hearings that exposed decades of similar containment operations across various wilderness areas. The investigation had expanded far beyond the original scope of the abandoned campsite and cave system. What began as a search for missing researchers had evolved into one of the largest multi-agency operations in the region's history, with implications that rippled through scientific, governmental, and environmental communities worldwide. The official report, now public through Freedom of Information channels, confirmed the ranger's original discoveries while adding contextual depth that exceeded even his suspicions. The unusual formations were indeed a hybrid mineral-biological entity, a previously undocumented life form existing at the intersection of geological and biological domains. Ancient beyond current dating capabilities, it had remained dormant until mining activities breached its containment decades ago. Project Limestone, supposedly terminated 14 years prior, had continued under classified redesignation, studying the entity while attempting to contain its gradual expansion. The researchers whose abandoned tent had initiated the investigation had stumbled upon this operation accidentally, documenting evidence that threatened to expose both the entity's existence and the governmental failure to properly assess its implications. The most disturbing revelations concerned human impact. 17 individuals had experienced direct exposure to the entity over the past decade. Maintenance workers, researchers, security personnel. All exhibited subtle neurological changes consistent with external influence or manipulation. While none showed immediate health threats, longitudinal studies revealed gradual personality alterations that suggested some form of cognitive restructuring. The missing researchers were among the fortunate, their exposure limited to initial sample collection before they recognized the danger and fled. Their journal, recovered during the Rangers' investigation, had documented progressive awareness of mental influences they attributed to proximity with the samples. Their desperate flight to their campsite, subsequent injury during a panic-induced accident, and eventual rescue by passing hikers had been concealed through quarantine protocols disguised as medical emergency procedures. Criminal proceedings had followed the exposure, though with mixed results characteristic of cases involving classified operations. 3 mid-level administrators faced charges of illegal detention for their role in concealing the researchers' whereabouts. 2 security contractors were indicted for destruction of evidence and obstruction of justice. Higher-level officials received administrative reprimands rather than criminal charges, bureaucratic protection that sparked public criticism, but reflected the complex reality of accountability within classified domains. More significant were the structural changes implemented across environmental management agencies. Independent oversight committees with scientific authority now monitored all research operations within wilderness areas. Classification protocols had been revised to require periodic review by multidisciplinary panels rather than indefinite secrecy. Whistleblower protections had been strengthened specifically for environmental services personnel. The regional impact was both immediate and evolving. The communities surrounding the park experienced the dual impact of scientific notoriety and economic disruption. Tourism initially declined amid safety concerns, then resurged with new focus on the area's unique scientific significance. Local businesses adapted, shifting from traditional wilderness recreation marketing to embracing the area's new identity as a site of biological discovery. The ranger observed these changes with complex emotions. Professional vindication came at significant personal cost. Though officially commended for his role in exposing critical information, informal professional consequences lingered. Some colleagues maintained distance, uncomfortable with his willingness to challenge established authority. Others sought his insights with new respect, recognizing the moral courage his actions had required. The entity itself remained both an ongoing scientific study and a contained threat. The original growth had been stabilized through specialized treatment protocols developed by an international research team. Expansion had halted, but complete removal proved impossible without catastrophic environmental impact to the surrounding ecosystem. Instead, permanent monitoring systems had been established, with redundant safeguards and transparent reporting requirements. In late winter, as the investigation transitioned from discovery to long-term management, the ranger received formal notification of the case's official status change from active investigation to ongoing monitoring. The document included detailed findings that confirmed his original concerns while expanding understanding of what had been discovered. The biological mineral hybrid represented a previously unknown evolutionary branch, neither plant nor animal nor fungal, but sharing characteristics with each while demonstrating unique properties. Its age suggested origin in Earth's earliest biological development phases. Its influence on human neurological systems appeared unintentional rather than predatory, a side effect of communication mechanisms evolved for interaction with other primitive life forms. Most significant was the confirmation that similar entities likely existed in other deep cave systems worldwide. The report outlined plans for systematic survey operations using newly developed detection protocols, with emphasis on areas with historical mining activity that might have disturbed dormant colonies. The ranger closed the report and turned toward the window, where late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. The wilderness he had sworn to protect 23 years ago had revealed itself to be more complex, more mysterious, and potentially more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Yet it remained fundamentally what it had always been, a system of delicate balances requiring both respect and vigilance from those who served as its guardians. The ceremony took place on a clear spring morning, 11 months after the abandoned tent discovery. The regional governor had selected the community center rather than government offices, a deliberate choice emphasizing public service over political pageantry. Attendance was limited to family members, key officials involved in the investigation, and representatives from environmental agencies directly impacted by the case. The ranger sat uncomfortably in the front row, dress uniform pressed to regulation standards that felt foreign after months of field operations. His wife beside him maintained a supportive presence, her quiet pride evident despite her traditional discomfort with public attention. Their son, home from university studies, projected the typical teenage mixture of embarrassment and reluctant admiration for his father's recognition. The governor spoke with uncharacteristic brevity, focusing on principles rather than personalities. Today, we recognize not just individual action, but the fundamental importance of ethical courage in public service. When systems fail, when protocols become shields rather than safeguards, the willingness to stand for transparency becomes our essential protection. The commendation presented to the ranger cited extraordinary commitment to environmental stewardship and public safety through persistent investigation and principled disclosure of critical information. The framed certificate would eventually hang in the station office, not from personal pride, but as reminder to younger rangers of their fundamental responsibilities beyond procedural compliance. The researchers whose abandoned tent had initiated the investigation attended remotely from the university where they had resumed modified duties following medical clearance. Their statement, read by the department chair, shifted focus from the ranger's actions to the broader implications of what had been discovered. The entity represents not just a scientific anomaly, but a profound reminder of how much remains unknown within environments we presumed cataloged and understood. Our continued existence as a species depends on maintaining humility before such discoveries. Most meaningful was the presence of the junior deputy who had provided crucial information during the early investigation. Now promoted to Environmental Crimes Division, he approached the ranger following the ceremony with professional respect rather than his previous nervous deference. That night, when you asked about the samples, I almost didn't say anything, the deputy confessed quietly. Department politics, career concerns, all those small fears that keep systems broken. Watching you risk everything to do what was right changed my entire approach to this job. The ranger nodded acknowledgement, uncomfortable with direct praise, but recognizing its importance to the younger officer's development. Systems function when people within them remember the purpose behind the protocols, he offered simply. The formal recognition concluded with minimal ceremony, transitioning to a community gathering that emphasized moving forward rather than dwelling on past events. Local officials outlined restoration plans for affected areas, ecological monitoring initiatives, and educational programs developed in response to the discovery. That evening, at his family's insistence, the ranger attended a small gathering at the local diner, the same establishment where he had met the sheriff during the investigation's tense early phase. Colleagues from the service joined family, friends, and community members in a celebration notable for its understated sincerity. The sheriff arrived late, still in uniform from an extended shift, and claimed the chair opposite the ranger with the comfortable familiarity of shared experience. "You know what keeps me up at night?" the sheriff asked, voice low beneath the ambient conversation. "Not what we found. It's what else might be out there that we haven't found yet. Things just waiting for someone to stumble across an abandoned tent or a strange track or an unusual formation." The ranger nodded, understanding the weight behind the observation. "We build systems to create the illusion of comprehensive knowledge," he replied. "Nature reminds us periodically how incomplete that knowledge remains. Worth remembering and worth forgetting in appropriate measure," the sheriff suggested. Can't do this job effectively if you're constantly looking for monsters under every rock, or within them, the ranger added with grim humor. Later, as the gathering dispersed and the ranger drove his family home through the quiet evening, his wife broke their companionable silence with uncharacteristic directness. "Was it worth it?" she asked. "Knowing what it cost, would you make the same choices again?" The ranger considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved. The professional isolation, the threats, the knowledge that his actions had permanently altered not just his career, but his understanding of the wilderness he had sworn to protect. "There's no perfect answer," he responded finally. "The system failed its fundamental purpose. Secrecy intended for protection became endangerment through isolation of critical information. Someone had to restore the balance." She nodded, accepting the response as characteristic of the man she had chosen to share her life with 20 years earlier. "The administration offered you the regional coordination position again," she noted. "Third time since this began." "Still not interested," he confirmed. "They need people in administrative roles who understand the importance of transparency. But they also need people in the field who remember why we established protected wilderness in the first place." The conversation turned to more immediate family matters as they arrived home, but the underlying question lingered in the ranger's thoughts as he moved through the familiar evening routine. Worth had never been a simple calculation in his profession. From his first day of service 24 years ago, the commitment had been to principle rather than outcome, to right action regardless of personal consequence. What had changed was not the fundamental equation but the scale of its application. The abandoned tent had led not just to a standard search and rescue operation, but to confrontation with systems failing their essential purpose. The response required had been proportional to that failure, extraordinary rather than routine, but still grounded in the same core obligation to protect both the wilderness and those who entered it. 18 months after the initial discovery, life had established new patterns. The ranger had returned to modified field duties, dividing time between standard wilderness management and specialized monitoring of the contained entity. His expertise regarding the northern caves had transformed from potential career liability to valued institutional knowledge as management approaches evolved from crisis response to long-term stewardship. Spring brought the familiar renewal of wilderness cycles, vegetation emerging from winter dormancy, wildlife returning to traditional territories, streams swollen with snowmelt. The ranger noted these patterns with the same attentive appreciation that had characterized his 25 years of service, but through a perspective permanently altered by knowledge of what existed beneath the visible landscape. The northern caves remained restricted, but under transparent scientific protocol rather than classified secrecy. International research teams rotated through the facility, their findings published in peer-reviewed journals rather than secured in classified repositories. The entity itself had stabilized following specialized treatment, neither expanding nor diminishing but maintaining a steady state that allowed for controlled study. On the anniversary of the tent discovery, the ranger requested a solitary patrol of the Eastern Trail. The area had been fully reopened to public access 6 months earlier following comprehensive environmental assessment. The campsite that had initiated the investigation had been documented, studied, and ultimately allowed to return to its natural state through standard wilderness restoration protocols. The ranger parked his vehicle at the familiar trailhead and proceeded on foot, moving with the measured pace of someone for whom the journey itself held significance beyond destination. The trail showed signs of recent maintenance, drainage channels cleared, fallen branches removed, markers refreshed, but otherwise remained as it had for decades, a narrow corridor through wilderness, largely indifferent to human passage. 3 miles in, he paused at the overlook that provided the panoramic view of the valley. The vista remained unchanged in its essential character, the lake reflecting spring sunlight, distant peaks still carrying snow cover, the forest a tapestry of emerging green. What had changed was his perception of what existed beyond visible surfaces, the awareness of complex systems operating at scales and time frames beyond immediate human comprehension. He continued to the river crossing where the bridge had been fully rebuilt following damage sustained during investigation operations. Beyond it, a small clearing marked the location where the tent had stood. Nature had reclaimed the space efficiently, new vegetation growing where equipment had compressed the soil, wildlife trails re-establishing traditional patterns, the drag marks to the river long since erased by successive rains and natural erosion. The ranger stood quietly at the perimeter of the clearing, observing without intrusion. The researchers had survived their encounter, recovered from their injuries, and resumed their careers with appropriate modifications. The entity had been contained, studied, and integrated into scientific understanding rather than concealed behind classification barriers. The systems that had failed their purpose had been reformed, however imperfectly, toward greater transparency and accountability. Yet completion remained elusive. The deputy from the Environmental Crimes Division had shared intelligence suggesting similar entities likely existed in wilderness areas across multiple jurisdictions, some potentially discovered and concealed through classification, others perhaps still undisturbed. The scientific team studying the Northern Caves entity regularly discovered new properties and behaviors that raised as many questions as they answered. Most significantly, the fundamental question remained unresolved. Was the entity truly ancient, a biological anomaly preserved from Earth's earliest evolutionary phases? Or was it, as some research suggested, potentially extraterrestrial in origin, delivered through meteorite impact and adapted to terrestrial conditions over millennia? The implications extended far beyond academic classification into profound questions about biological development, environmental stewardship, and humanity's understanding of life itself. The ranger placed a small marker at the clearing's edge, not an official monument but a private acknowledgement of the lives altered by what had begun at this location. The simple stone, selected from the riverbed and engraved only with the date, would likely be displaced by natural processes within seasons. Its purpose was not permanence, but momentary recognition of how single events could trigger cascading consequences beyond any individual's capacity to fully predict or control. As he turned to depart, movement at the clearing's far edge caught his attention. A juvenile black bear, moving with the awkward confidence of recent independence from maternal protection. The animal paused, registering the ranger's presence with alert curiosity rather than alarm. For a moment they regarded each other across the cleared space, representatives of wilderness and civilization in temporary equilibrium. The bear moved on after brief assessment, disappearing into the forest with purpose rather than fear. The ranger watched its departure with professional approval. The wilderness continued its cycles regardless of human discovery or intervention. The mysteries beneath the surface had always existed. Only human awareness had changed. He began the return journey with steady pace, noting details that most visitors would overlook. The subtle signs of beaver activity upstream, track patterns indicating healthy predator-prey balance, evidence of appropriate forest succession in areas previously damaged by weather events. These ordinary observations provided necessary counterbalance to the extraordinary knowledge he now carried. Reminder that effective stewardship required attention to both the remarkable and the routine. Dawn broke over the northern wilderness with the same stillness that had marked that autumn morning 2 years earlier. Thin ribbons of mist hovered above the forest floor, weaving between ancient pines that stood like sentinels over the landscape. The air carried the familiar crispness that stung the lungs and left a ghost of breath hanging in the morning light. The ranger stood on the porch of the station outpost, a steaming mug of coffee warming his weathered hands. 25 years in the service had established rhythms that persisted through dramatic events and ordinary days alike. The wilderness remained fundamentally itself, complex, beautiful, occasionally dangerous, eternally worthy of protection. What had changed was not the land, but the understanding of those charged with its stewardship. The truth discovered beneath the surface had transformed awareness of what wilderness truly contained, not just visible ecosystems, but potentially fundamental secrets about life's development on Earth and beyond. The horror that had frozen everyone who encountered the entity gave way to cautious scientific engagement once fear yielded to knowledge. The ranger's radio crackled softly on his hip, the morning check-in from headquarters. He responded with practiced brevity, confirming his scheduled patrol route. After the acknowledgement, he added an uncharacteristic personal observation. "Perfect morning out here. Worth remembering why we do this job." The truth about the Northern Caves entity would continue to emerge through scientific study, rather than classified concealment. Similar discoveries in other wilderness areas would likely follow as detection protocols improved and awareness expanded. The systems responsible for environmental protection would continue evolving toward greater transparency and accountability, however imperfectly. Some mysteries would remain unsolved. Some questions would persist without definitive answers. The entity's true origin, its complete capabilities, its ultimate significance within planetary biological development, These understandings might require generations of careful study rather than immediate resolution, but the fundamental principle had been preserved. Truth, however disturbing, served life better than comfortable ignorance or convenient concealment. The abandoned tent had led not just to scientific discovery, but to reaffirmation that systems meant to protect could only function properly through commitment to this essential understanding. The ranger drained the last of his coffee, the familiar routine grounding him in the present moment rather than past discoveries or future implications. The wilderness stretched before him, simultaneously known and unknown, revealed and mysterious. His duty remained what it had always been: to protect, to preserve, and to bear witness with integrity to whatever might be discovered within its boundaries. Don't forget to subscribe for the next installment of Wilderness Mysteries, where we explore the untold secrets of our natural world and the dedicated professionals who protect it.